There's all of this ridiculous controversy over what we label this thing. President Trump suggested openly the other day that this is the Chinese virus, and he was smacked for it. And President Trump was asked about this yesterday. He said, yeah, I'm going to continue to call it the Chinese virus because the Chinese government's responsible for all of this.
China and others have criticized you for using the phrase Chinese virus. How do you feel about that? Are you going to continue using that phrase?
Well, China was putting out information which was false, that our military gave this to them. That was false. And rather than having an argument, I said, I have to call it where it came from. It did come from China. So I think it's a very accurate term. But no, I didn't appreciate the fact that China was saying that our military gave it to them. Our military did not give it to anybody.
Critics say using that phrase creates a stigma.
No, I don't think so. No, I think saying that our military gave it to them creates a stigma.
Correct, accurate, win for President Trump. This is absolutely correct. Okay, can we just be frank about this? The Chinese government is responsible for this. They're responsible for this at every level. The Chinese government actively sought to silence people who are talking about the coronavirus. They actively tried to arrest people. They forced them to recant true statements about coronavirus. Not only that, according to the UK, the Sunday Times, Chinese scientists destroyed proof of the virus in December. According to the Times of London, Chinese laboratories identified a mystery virus as a highly infectious new pathogen by late December last year. They were ordered to stop tests, destroy samples, and suppress the news, a Chinese media outlet has revealed. A regional health official in Wuhan, center of the outbreak, demanded the destruction of the lab samples that established the cause of unexplained viral pneumonia on January 1st. China did not acknowledge there was human-to-human transmission until more than 3 weeks later. The detailed revelations by Kixin Global, a respected independent publication, provide the clearest evidence yet of the scale of the cover-up in the crucial early weeks when the opportunity was lost to control the outbreak. By the way, the WHO bought this hook, line, and sinker. The World Health Organization suggested in middle of January that coronavirus is not a threat because they had been informed of that by the Chinese government. Okay, the Chinese government is responsible for this. They're responsible for it from beginning to end. The Chinese government attempted actively to silence doctors warning others about the disease, according to the Washington Post. As word of a mysterious virus mounted, Li Wenliang shared suspicions in a private chat with his fellow medical school graduates. The doctor said 7 people seem to have contracted SARS, the respiratory illness from China that was sent to 24 countries and left hundreds dead in the early 2000s. He urged people to be careful. Li and 7 other doctors were quickly summoned by Chinese authorities for propagating rumors about SARS-like cases in the area. The warnings were prescient. Soon, health officials worldwide would be scrambling to combat a novel virus with a striking genetic resemblance to SARS. As Jim Garrity says at National Review, Chinese authorities spent January denying it could spread between humans, something doctors had known was happening since late December, and now we know they were destroying the proof, and went ahead with a Chinese Lunar New Year banquet involving tens of thousands of families in Wuhan. Doctors say in Wuhan, people who had no connection to the Huanan market were among the first showing the symptoms. So the Chinese authorities understood human-to-human transition was happening right from the very outset. Even by the Chinese government's own accounts of events, President Xi Jinping knew about the disease for 2 weeks before making any public comments about it, under fire for its response to the coronavirus epidemic. According to the New York Times, China's authoritarian government appears to be pushing a new account of events that presents President Xi Jinping as taking early action to fight the outbreak that has convulsed the country. But in doing so, the authorities have acknowledged for the first time that Mr. Xi was aware of the epidemic and involved in the response nearly 2 weeks before he first spoke publicly about it, and while people at the epicenter were still downplaying the dangers. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Chinese government let some 5 million people leave Wuhan without screening. Chinese medical authorities also banned staff from discussing the disease in public or via text or images. 8 days after this ban went in place, a nurse in one of these departments started to feel sick, was confirmed she was infected by coronavirus. By early March, 3 doctors at this particular hospital had died from the infection. Even today, Chinese citizens who criticize the government are disappeared. Okay, WeChat is currently banning Chinese Americans for talking about Hong Kong. I mean, this is insane. The Chinese government announced yesterday it's going to expel American journalists. According to Mark Tracy, Edward Wong, and Lara Jakes, in a sharp escalation of tensions between the two superpowers, China announced on Tuesday it would expel American journalists working for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. It also demanded that those outlets, as well as the Voice of America and Time Magazine, provide the Chinese government with detailed information about their operations. The announcement was made by China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They're blaming it on America booting out Chinese propagandists who'd been claiming that America's military was behind this whole thing. But in reality, is it possible that China is still covering this thing up? Of course, that's highly possible, is that China is still covering this thing up. So I don't want to hear any of this crap from Stephen Colbert about how it's racist to call this the Chinese virus. It is the Chinese government virus. And furthermore, once this abates, and once things start to go back to normal, the Trump administration should tell the Chinese government that the travel ban on Chinese citizens moving to and from the United States and on American citizens moving to and from China should continue until the Chinese authoritarian government shuts down these wet markets. Okay, the wet markets are these animal markets where people are eating civets, people are eating bats, people are eating snakes. Okay, this has now been responsible for swine flu, bird flu, SARS, H1N1, and this. Okay, so we have seen virus after virus after virus emanating from these wet markets in China, and the Chinese authoritarian government, which will jail you or maybe kill you, depending on what you say about the government or what you say about coronavirus, they won't shut down these markets. How is it that the international community is willing to allow a global pandemic to take place on its watch and the entire world economy to shudder to a screeching halt? I mean, it's unbelievable. The entire world economy is now stopped dead, like completely stopped dead. All because China would not shut down the practice of people eating frickin' bats at the local markets. This has been a problem for decades. Okay, this is nothing new. Going all the way back to the 1950s, there was an Asian flu. It was literally called the Asian flu, an Asian flu outbreak in the late 1950s, and it came from these animal markets. The Chinese government is an authoritarian government. At the very least, they should be outlawing these markets. They should be prosecuting people who are selling exotic animals for people to eat. And this is and by the way, that's not cultural racism in any way. Don't eat the frickin' bats, you idiots. I mean, seriously, how many lives would have been saved if the Chinese government had spent 1 ounce of its authoritarianism cracking down on perfectly illegal activity or activity that ought to be illegal, like eating the local wildlife? I mean, this is insane. The Trump administration, the rest of the world should be on board for this too, honestly. Like, can we all afford to do this once every 4 or 5 years? Because that's the future. The future is that once every 4 or 5 years, once every 10 years, there will be another virus emanating from China, which has yet to shut down this stuff and then has covered it up in authoritarian fashion, and they unleash it on an unsuspecting global community. And then all of the people in the media go, oh, it's so racist. It's so ethnically unpalatable to say this is the Chinese virus. It has nothing to do with the skin color of the people or the location or the ethnicity of the people who are saying this stuff. It has to do with the Chinese communist authoritarian government, which has now unleashed for the 1 millionth time a virus on the rest of the world because they will not shut down what is obviously disgusting activity. I'm sorry, it is disgusting to eat a civet. Okay, it's gross. Beyond being gross. I don't care. You can do whatever is gross to your liking. Okay, I'm a libertarian on this stuff, except if there are externalities. And it turns out you eating a civet, you eating a pangolin, has some pretty significant externalities. You think we're going to lose $10 trillion in this economy because of this routine? Seriously. There better be some consequences to the Chinese government after all of this. I mean, the stock market, again, is down below 20,000. This is wild. And our chief focus is Stephen Colbert sitting by his fireside in his nicely apportioned mansion, talking about how terrible it is to label this the Chinese virus. Give me a freaking break. Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, is warning that this virus could yield a 20% jobless rate if we don't spend trillions of dollars. Is that worth not punishing the Chinese government and forcing them to shut down these markets at the very least? I mean, I'm not even saying that we ought to force the Chinese government to openness. I'm not even saying that we ought to root for the overthrow of the Chinese communist regime, which, by the way, we should. I mean, it's an evil, evil regime. Forget about what they do with the civets. This is a regime that has overseen the forced sterilization of presumably tens of millions of women over the course of the last 30 years. I mean, it's an evil government. It is. It is an evil government, just as evil as the Soviet Union, just nobody talks about it. I mean, literally is evil. The Great Leap Forward killed far more people than the Holodomor, the murder of millions in Ukraine by the Stalin regime. Okay, this is an evil regime, and we've been treating it with kid gloves for years. We should not be. But put that aside. Even if you're just talking about shutting down these ridiculous eating the exotic animals markets, we're going to go from a 3.5 unemployment rate in this country to a 20% unemployment rate in this country because China refused to crack down on people eating wild animals. Seriously? Here is Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. Apparently, he says that the jobless rate could hit 20%, according to CNBC.
I'm told that in those meetings that the Treasury Secretary said that if Congress does not pass this package, that unemployment could touch 20%, trying to highlight the dire consequences that could await this country if Congress does not actually move forward this package of unprecedented proportions that would deliver that money directly to Americans.
Okay, so the measures that are currently being taken by the federal government, by the way, include things like keeping that commercial paper window open, which is a good thing. They're talking about floating cash to people so that they can make rent for the next couple of months. There's been some talk. Andrew Ross Sorkin has a piece in the New York Times today suggesting that effectively the government float zero interest loans for the next 5 years repayable to businesses that need them over the next few months. And again, all of this, I think, should be off the table if it were not the government that were imposing the lockdown in the first place. The government is imposing the lockdown in the first place. That means that these businesses, normally the answer is, like in 2007, 2008, businesses that were poorly run and made bad decisions, and then they're hit by a downturning economy that is not the result of an external shock or an internal shock directed by government, that those businesses don't deserve a bailout. But if you are talking about the federal government forcibly shutting down businesses, that is a different story. So even that distinguishes between businesses. Like the airline business, and there's a good case to be made. The airlines should not actually be bailed out, that we should be bailing out their employees because the airlines have been using their money for stock buybacks because the airlines should have banked up enough cash to at least survive, even if it means furloughing their employees for the foreseeable future. And then we should compensate the employees. But if you're talking about keeping business afloat for a couple of months, if you're talking about making sure that basically we freeze the economy in place for a couple of months, as long as there's an end date to that, then all possibilities are sort of on the table. But we should examine the consequences of those policies. The danger, of course, to open-ended loans like that is a lot of people who are never going to repay those loans. There is some winnowing that is going to happen in this economy. This is going to change the way people live in particularly significant ways. Even when this ends, the movie industry is going to take a hit. The entertainment industry is going to take a hit. Do you really want the government floating loans to industries that are going to take a permanent hit over the course of time because our way of life just radically changed? That is unclear how people earn back their money at this point. Perhaps the best way to do it, Sorkin suggests that basically you should go to the banks and then you should say to the banks, we're going to back whatever loans you choose to give. And that may be the best way to do it because the banks actually have an actuarial interest in only giving out loans that will eventually be repaid, as opposed to the federal government, which has an interest in handing out free cash, helicopter cash to everybody. Okay, so the bottom line here is that we don't know where any of this is going. And you are seeing local restaurants shut down. You're seeing people hurt. We're going to have to figure out in pretty short order what the trajectory of this thing is. Greatest hope, by May, this thing starts to wane. By May, people start going back to, if not normal, something slightly resembling normal. It's going to change our way of life, particularly in small spaces. I think that the concert industry is going to have a rough time. I think a lot of local restaurants are going to have a rough time. Everything may translate over to in-room dining, delivery. It may transfer over to bigger restaurants with more space so that people can be spaced out a little bit more. But with all of that said, we are going to have to figure out what the second step here is, because it is just not sustainable for everybody to be locked in their homes for 6, 12, 18 months. That's not sustainable. The economy cannot take it. Because at a certain point, who's going to buy the debt? Who's going to buy the bonds? At a certain point, the federal government's going to have to just start inflating the currency, at which point everybody who has any money is worth nothing.